Hi, this is Roundtable Discussions. I'm Steve Williams, and I'm here with a couple of guests. I've got two gentlemen here that are both accomplished authors and industry icons. To my left, first, I've got Dan Beaulieu of DB Management and DMR Publishing, a brand new venture, and Joe Fjelstad of Verdant Electronics. And the topic for today is outsourcing. Has it lost its luster? So thanks for coming, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Asking us.
So we've heard a whole bunch of buzzwords like reshoring and onshoring, and it all comes down to bringing business back to America, right? So insourcing is something that's the new buzzword for this year, as some companies are bringing back business in little increments. Desktop PCs and Macs and telecom business is starting to come back in little drips and drabs back to the U.S. Do you think that's a trend? Do you think it's more for the press, or do you think there's some meat behind it?
Well, Steve, one of the things that I notice is we can talk about onshoring in electronics for a moment, but if you look at other things, if you look at IKEA, if you look at BMW, if you look at Honda, those guys are really here for real. They came here for economic reasons. They came here for the workforce, a talented workforce. They're in right-to-work states, actually, they didn't move to Detroit, they moved to Alabama and places like that. So I think that's an encouraging trend. Before we get into electronics, I like that idea, and I think more of that is going to happen.
Excellent. Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there is clearly a mandate to bring jobs back, trying to crawl out of the latest, recession or depression. Somebody made it very clear the difference between a recession and depression is in a recession you lose your job, in a depression I lose mine.
Yeah, that's right.
So the idea of bringing jobs to America, they talked about a jobless recovery, but we are actually starting to see some jobs. The question is the quality of those jobs.
The quality of those jobs, because we've seen all of the fast food jobs and all of that and what a problem that is. But I think 2008, 2009 scared the bejesus out of the American populace to the point, before that, working with companies I work with selling boards, you heard about how great it was in China, how much better it was at technology in Japan. You heard those things from the big guys, and you don't anymore. There's nobody bragging about going offshore. At least I don't run into them.
Right. Well, I remember as it started out, the board manufacturing that started to leave the U.S. Well, you go way back, right?
Yeah.
Remember, all the OEMs were vertically integrated.
Yes.
IBM built its own laminate. It built its own boards. It built its own size. It did its packaging. It did everything in a fully vertically integrated company. And then the game changer was Surface Mount. When it just became too darned expensive to capitalize for that, and it became that saying, okay, well, first we get rid of the boards, then we start getting rid of the assembly of them, and that it basically started to hollow out the OEM, and then the cost associated with that, touch labor aspect of it. I mean, we've farmed out so many technologies over the years that semiconductor IC packaging, for example, we farmed it off to Asia, to Malaysia. Because it was done by hand, little gals doing it. But the automation followed, and now they own it.
They own it, and we gave it away.
Exactly.
We gave it away for a $29 VCR or a DVD player. We gave it away for that, cheaper, which always drives me crazy because, I like to say, if you're a great chef, you don't run around to buy the cheapest ingredients. If you're a craftsman, you don't run around buying the cheapest wood you can buy to sculpt something. But when we're talking about what's supposed to be the greatest product in the world, we're running around finding the cheapest product we can put ingredients to put into it.
Let me ask you a question, because we talked earlier about this, and I talked in one of my classes on Sunday on this. Don't we own a little bit of skin in this as well by our expectations?
Absolutely.
The example I used the other day for discussion was, am I going to pay $100 for a DVD player that's got a Made in America stamp on it, or am I going to go buy a $25 one from China that's going to last me 3 years, that I'm probably going to want a new one in 3 years because the technology changes?
Well,
how do you combat that?
I think that was a ridiculous question a few years ago, and I think it's becoming a more real question. You know, there are TVs made in this country. I know people, Vizio, I believe, is made in California. And I think people will go out of their way. I know people who have gone out of their way to buy that television
Really?
set.
Okay.
You know, I think, because the other thing is it's not $20 and $100 anymore. It's
Right.
getting closer. I think we're going to get into that.
Oh, we'll talk a little bit later about how do we get more competitive. But
Right.
Joe, you and I had a conversation right before here talking about, well, we kind of expected this kind of a thing to happen in China. And if you look at the wages in China, that's a contributor, right? They've gone up 80% in the last 5 years, and they continue to increase about 15% a year. Do you think that that's because the light's coming on, that, hey, we've been selling it at too much of a discount to this point?
Well, I mean, they
or?
basically were buying markets, you know,
Yes.
subsidized, heavily subsidized by the government. I don't decry that aspect of it. I think everybody in the world should be able to work and make a living. Obviously, difference in terms of cost structures, you know,
Right.
so it doesn't cost as much at that time. But there was a couple of things, as I mentioned. I thought at one point in time, you know, we're going to see the folks in Japan, or China rather, were going to realize that they had misplaced the decimal point. You know, and that, you know, you can only, you know, drink your own blood for a certain period of time, and then you know, it fills your stomach, but, you know, eventually you become, you know, you die, right?
Right.
Yeah, I completely agree. A few years ago, I was in China with our friend Bob Neves, and he said the sooner we can get these people to the middle class,
Yeah.
and I've used that
Absolutely.
quote a lot because it's very, very true. And if you look at the salaries now, that's coming on.
Right.
I mean, there's two factors. If you remember in the 70s, the Japanese were geniuses.
Yep.
You know, they were really geniuses. And what it really boiled down to is they had a 1950s economy when we had a 1970s economy, and they quickly caught up.
Yeah.
You know, the technology was there. Everybody's good at something. I think we're seeing that in China to a certain point.
Japan also did something very important in bringing over Deming. You know,
They
is
did.
it essentially saying that quality was, you know, they were, you know, lambasted early on, post World War II. As, you know, made in Japan was, you know, synonymous with junk.
Right.
And they, you know, they have too much pride.
Yeah.
And they learned how to really grasp this idea of quality, making things that became, you know, you may have heard that last grain of rice, you know, the idea of statistical process control and being able to pull out that last thing. Very, I mean, relentless, maniacal, if you will. But it pays such great dividends.
Right.
Quality pays
Right.
amazing dividends. And I'm not going to.
Oh, no.
And we'll probably, our culture is we will probably never do that. I read about, I don't remember who wrote this book, I did a review on it. It was one of the first marketing strategists in the world. And he talked about the fact that Americans are so different. Americans don't want 30-year-old Toyotas. We don't want a 30-year-old. We want the next Toyota.
Yeah.
You know, we don't want anything that lasts forever. We want a new one. Where other cultures, Europeans of course, want 2,000-year-old churches. We don't. We tear down churches.
Well, quality is
everything.
a whole other discussion. We could talk about that for another hour, because the
right,
reason
of
that
course.
Japan did that is
Of course.
because the U.S. rejected it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't want to listen to it. We were fat, dumb, and happy, and
Yeah.
they took it to Japan, and they ended up kicking our butts
But
off.
I say that was one factor. The
Yeah,
economics were
absolutely.
the other factor.
Well, back to that, you know, back to the subject, is that notion of reshoring, insourcing, however you want to call it. You know, we're on the cusp of having to do it. We've touched on it. You've mentioned it. The fact is that the folks in China are necessarily, if you're making these products every day, you know, and you can't afford to buy them, right? In other words, your wages won't allow you to make to purchase the things that you make. You know, you create a lot of pent-up demand and frustration, and they have to do something about that. And they are. They're focusing, turning inwards towards markets. They've got 1 billion plus customers,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
You know, a market that is 3 times the U.S. So why not fulfill their needs? Not that they're going to abandon, you know, the U.S. A lot of people have obviously U.S. companies that have footprints in Japan or in China. I mean, global, as we talked about
Right.
that early on. It's all over the world.
Yeah.
So, you know, and as you mentioned, they have footprints here too. Foxconn, we all just read recently, is looking at setting up manufacturing, you know, in the U.S. I don't know if that's an outshoring or an inshoring or an offshoring, or, you know, how does that?
This is a question I have, and I don't really have an answer, so I'll ask you guys. Are they placating us, or are they really mean
Right,
to be
it's a
here?
press thing, right? I mean,
Yeah,
Apple did the same
yeah.
thing. It's a drop in the bucket, but they made this big deal about moving jobs back to the U.S. Is that just to overcome some of the negative publicity they've had recently?
Well, and Google's tried to do the same thing, but I think that having, you know, when you do a full, cost analysis of the time and opportunity, the transport back and forth. What do you do? Those things are all part of the calculus, and you really have to understand it. I mean, it used to be with memory, the fact that a lot of memory was made in the U.S. and shipped overseas to get packaged and back, is that that time and then the spot price of memory is that you're losing money while the planes are in the air. Boatloads of money while the planes are in the air. This goes back into the 80s. So those kinds of things become, need to be factored in, and business people are, keenly aware of that. They're very, have their eyes on the bottom line all the time.
Right, right.
So how much do you think that some of the hidden costs are impacting this, where you look at, I mean, printed circuit boards are pretty easy to ship overseas, right? But something that's bigger and heavier and you might have to put it on a boat, right? Then you've got 8 weeks on the ocean, you've got a lot of inventory tied up, and if you have an issue, there's a lot of money at stake. How much of that do you think is part of this?
I think being able to be closer proximity to the solution, or to affect a solution, rather than have to send engineers over. We've all made multiple trips to Asia, and I love it. I mean, I love going there. I love working and meeting the people there, and I'm very impressed with what I've seen. Very, very, excellent work with a lot of great people doing marvelous things. But on the other hand, the proximity to the customer, I think, is incredibly valuable, because you get your shorter cycles of learning. We're all learning, and get through those cycles on a quicker basis. And if you're close, it makes it easier, especially to the manufacturer.
You're right there. I work with certain shops who do new product development quick turn. And some of their customers will be the big guys, Microsoft and everything. They can do 16, 17 iterations. Yeah. Now, it's very difficult to do even if you're going 300 miles, never mind, 12,000 miles or whatever. It's very, very difficult to do. Because to me, like a bare board, part of the design is the fabrication. You're doing the development, and it's one hand clapping until you try to build the board, and I think that's the start of lower end onshoring. Then you've got new product development and all. This country's gone new product development crazy in the sense of from Kickstarter to the Makers Organization, more and more of that. I think, I was thinking about this the other day. I think we've got a resurgence of interest in business. If you look at shows, The Pitch, Shark Tank, Profit, these shows are becoming best-selling shows where families sit there and watch Shark Tank and argue about it. Who would have thought these business shows would capture an audience, what they're doing right now?
Well, we are an incredibly creative nation.
Yes.
And that is to our credit. And I mean, it comes from the fact that we are, a microcosm of the world.
We are, and I think what we sell, and this is almost a cliche now, we sell culture. We sell culture. If you remember, I think I said this in another interview. Right. Remember when Lee Iacocca talked about, I can't sell my cars, and I can only sell blue jeans and hamburgers to Japan. Blue jeans and hamburgers won. They won. If you look at Japan, if you look at the society, whether you think we improved it or destroyed it, we changed it. The working for life, all of that is gone. This is why the Muslim countries are terrified of us. It's really the culture change that we bring to those countries.
It is that cultural hegemony that we have, and it is, in a way you find it, you don't want to deny people the benefits. This is a great country, and I say I'm blessed. When I lived and worked in the Soviet Union. Well, I went to work in the Soviet Union. When I left, it was Russia, but I can't take credit. But it was a very
Dan would have taken credit.
It was an interesting time to be there. But you almost feel apologetic of the fact that I just, it wasn't my decision to be born in America. It was the decision of, some very adventurous people, some ancestors who made some journeys, sometimes, very treacherous journeys across oceans. And land, and to come to places where they could, they felt they had opportunity. And so I was lucky that way. These people were born in another part, and people in Africa and all these. But we shouldn't, somehow we've got to find a way to, without taking ourselves down, bring others up.
I think you're absolutely right, and I know we've gone astray with onshoring, but I think this is the backbone of it. There's a documentary that came out last year by Alexandra Pelosi, about people becoming Americans. And there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people who want to be Americans every year. There aren't other countries like that. There's not thousands of people who want to become, go to Russia, for example. But we have that. So there's even a certain extent, if we behave ourselves, of the world that watches us and says, if they're not doing well, we're not doing well. And there's some sort of protection that goes on. Once in a while, we're bad guys and we go do something we're not supposed to do, and that turns for a while. But ultimately, when you see the faces on those immigrants from Iran, from Iraq, from Russia coming here to this country, we're selling hope. We are selling hope.
Well, and we need to provide them, a way to facilitate that. And that's where, having manufacturing, which is a foundation of a country. When you lose your manufacturing base, you're gone. You're not in the game anymore. I remember Nesbitt's book on, megatrends. He talked about a knowledge society out there in the future. And the knowledge society said, what do you do with that? I mean, what do? You go down to the baker and say, look, I'm going to tell you something and you give me a loaf of bread. That you need some other kind of an exchange mechanism in that. Not that knowledge isn't important, but what do you do with the knowledge? How do you monetize that knowledge in a useful way that's going to be good for the maximum number of people? And so I think, bringing back jobs is going to be an important. Manufacturing, a closer proximity to the ideas that we're generating. We are a generation or an idea generation factory. And how do we pull that all together? That's where the fun is.
Well, I go right along with you. I'm seeing systems in place like Kickstarter. There's another one, and I don't remember the name, where literally this guy set up this company and he's got all of the people who can make things happen there. And if you have an idea, you apply, you show up there, and they take over the idea. They give you 10, 12% of the idea, but it moves. It can be an eyeglass holder or whatever. But they're doing that, and this is what I was referring to with all these television shows. Everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. I see the reliving of the American dream coming back at a much more personal, individual, smaller scale.
Well, that's a great lead in. Let's think about maybe wrapping this up with a couple things. One, you guys both work with a lot of companies and manufacturing companies. What are you telling them, or what do you see them doing to become more competitive, to allow some of this stuff to come back?
The companies I deal with are really, I got to say, they're not really going that route.
I mean, we can't compete on labor, but we can compete on other things, right?
I'm pushing them to sell value more than competitive. The companies I work with are smaller, and they provide a service that somebody else can't provide. Rather than lower the cost, lower the price, it's do things that will sustain the price or make it better.
Right. Okay.
And that's kind of my philosophy, and that's the way I work.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to echo what Peter Diamandis said this morning. Is that in essence, is that you need to be the authors and in control of your own destruction and rebirth. Is that he said something. He said the same thing that I've observed and have said for many years. Is that change is the only constant in the universe. Get used to it, embrace it, make it part of your daily existence, because it's going to happen. And you're either with you or without you.
Right.
So, I was impressed by the fact that he's talking about, a large percentage of the companies that are started today are going to be done in 15 years. You go, whoa, that's a short life cycle, right? So you want to be always, in pursuit of your own destruction. In other words, don't hang on to it, because, it's not going to hold you.
That's right.
So,
Outstanding. Any closing comments? What do we do? What are the next steps? What do you see? We come back here next year. What do you think we're going to be talking about on this topic?
I think we're going to be, I hope and believe that we're going to be talking more of the same, what Joe said about change. Yeah, once you get over the fact, once you stop hating change and embrace it, you move on.
Okay.
And, and the fact that you figure out how to do something, and you call somebody who can do something better than you can. I mean, we've done it, you and I, and you put that together, and it's like, you can get a lot done if you don't care who gets the credit.
Right.
And if we work that way, I think there'll be more of that. And I think it could save our industry, in the circuit board industry, if we do more of that. We're not great collaborators at all, and we
Totally
need to
agree.
be to survive.
I think the other, in my mind, is that there's inertia, right? Positive and negative, all right? And when you come into inertia, overcoming it, there's a flywheel effect. Things in motion tend to stay in motion. Trying to get the flywheel rolling is very, very challenging. And so we have to overcome that on the ground level with companies and getting people to say, okay, I'm going to move on something. I'm going to make something different. And it doesn't make any difference. Anything worth doing, as somebody said, a sage said, anything worth doing is worth doing badly at first. Learn from it, move forward. I think that's what we need to do, is find a way to embrace this. I think back now 30 some odd years when I worked at Boeing, and I had a senior engineer, World War II vet, sat behind me, and I was a young engineer, always flustered by the lack of progress and how we could do this, we could do that. And he'd sit back with his hands behind his head and say, Joe, he says, you got to understand, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And we like that familiarity with what it is that we do. We'd like to be able to get up with some predictability. Manufacturing abhors change. Don't touch the knobs. We want that consistency. But without that, you never know what you can do. I think that's kind of the challenge. I think is trying to figure out where are our limits really, and that's what I hope to see, us collectively moving towards. And I have great faith that we'll just keep getting better.
Yeah, that's a good note to end on. Very positive. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I enjoyed your perspectives and your comments, and I appreciate you showing up today.
Thanks.
I like chatting with you
once
guys.
again, thanks for tuning in. This is Steve Williams with our panel discussions.